So this is Unpacking K-5 Math for Caregivers, and we are going to talk about how kids start building fractional concepts. Jessica, you want to get started? I don't know if you're going to talk about how they start, but let's talk about building fractional concepts.
We could start with a problem and see what we think, what we can learn.
That sounds awesome.
About fractions. This is one that I often love to start with. It's equal sharing. So we've got, let's say we don't have 5 people here today, but suppose we had 5 people and they were sharing these 4 churros equally, and they ate all of the churros. So we wonder about, well, how much of one churro does each of those people get?
So you want us to give you the answer?
Well, I'm wondering, first off, what I love about math in general is that there's so many different ways to think about a problem like this. So maybe that's a good way to start. Like, how would you think about it?
Well, I'll tell you how I think about it, but I actually had a whole conversation about this the other day with my family, because for me, the answer is 4/5 immediately.
Oh, how'd you know that?
Because I have 4 divided by 5, and that's where 4/5 is.
Nice.
But people don't think that way. I have to say that. Even in my household, we had exactly that conversation the other day. And even my family, and some are very good at math. Well, I shouldn't say that way, but they were like, oh, I don't think about it that way. But for me, that's immediate. Oh, 4 divided by 5 is 4/5.
And for this one, I mean, so I've done some similar problems like this recently with my pre-service teachers, but then also I have some work samples where I went out and worked with some 4th graders around this type of thing, similar to you, Jessica. So for what's interesting for me is to think about a way an adult might think about it versus the way a child. So I will say that because I'm influenced when I think about I'm influenced by these kids. And so I'm thinking about, okay, I'm going to use a knife, or am I going to just break the churro? Either way. So I'm going to give each of those 5 people a half of a churro first, right? So that's going to take up 2 of the churros plus a half of that 3rd one. And so that for the other half of the 3rd one, I would break that into 5 pieces, which means they would get a 1/10 of that churro.
Ooh.
And then that last churro, I would break up into 5 pieces. So they get a 1/5 of that. So they're getting a half of a churro and a 1/5 of a churro and a 1/10 of a churro. But again, I'm doing that splitting because I wonder, like, if I didn't have those recent experiences, whether I would maybe split them all up into 5 pieces, or, but I know that a lot of children would not split them all into 5 pieces.
But you do see some children splitting all into 5 pieces if they've seen it before, and then you get 1/5 from each of the 4 churros.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of kids I've seen will start breaking everything into halves. So I don't want to repeat how Temple shared, but I will say that I see that one a lot with kids. Over time, I would also agree that kids will start to split each of them into 5 equal parts, and then it becomes like really interesting to think about, well, how much is that? Because if you notice the question, I kind of wrote it that way on purpose. I said, well, how much of one churro does each person get? So it's interesting to think about, well, if I had 1/5 of the first one and 1/5 of the second and 1/5 of the third and 1/5 of the fourth, well, how much is that? How do I know? And I think that's really interesting when you put it up next to Temple's solution, because there I had a half and a fifth and a tenth. How much is that? And how do I know?
Yeah.
That's where I love, to think about situations like this, because not only are there different ways to go about it, but we get to talk about how these different ways these different results and different ways we're getting to quantify, if you will, is a fifth and a fifth and a fifth and a fifth the same thing as a half and a fifth and a tenth? How can that be? And talk through that. And I just think it really leads to some rich conversations.
Well, this idea also that you just mentioned, I had not thought about that. But if I'm getting 1/5 of the first and 1/5 of the second, and then a fifth of the third and a fifth of the fourth, it's really abstract to then say that's in general 4/5 of a churro. Right? That's a pretty abstract statement after that.
It really is. And I think, again, that's that whole thing. Like for us, it's like, oh, yeah, it's 4/5. But for kids, like to put those fifths together, that's a sense of real like wonderment for them at first, to think about that as a quantity. Well, what does she mean when she says, how much of one churro? I split, this one into fifths and I took one out of there and then I've got all these ones together. Well, how does that compare back to one churro? That whole idea of that, I'm like talking in terms of how much of one, because like how much of all the churros becomes another question.
Exactly. Yeah, with not with young students, but I like to use a similar problem that it's about bagels and it's in bags of 12, and at first they want to answer as how much of a bagel, but the question is how much of a dozen bagels. And so this whole unit issue here is very complex.
How do you find that kids talk about the bagels, like the units involved there? I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, this is for later on, but typically before they share, they want to open, the question is about how many dozen of bagels. So you don't really have to open the bag.
Right.
Theoretically, right? But they all share, open the bagels, mentally open the bags of bagels, share the bagels. And then when they answer how many bagels, I ask, well, but I was asking how much of a dozen, and then it's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, so like what I hear there is that the context as well becomes really important. And
Right.
then like that whole idea of like single bagels versus a bag as a unit becomes really important there.
Yeah. And I think the fact that you can open the bag and share makes you more likely to want to do than perhaps the churros, right? The churros I'll have to cut, but the bag of bagels is so like, just open the bagels and share. Open the bags, share the bagels.
Yeah, I wonder if we pose this as like bags of, bags of bagels, for instance, if kids would solve it differently.
Yeah.
But I think, Jessica, with this problem, you've raised a really, not only the value of doing these types of like fair sharing problems, but I'm thinking about for caregivers, the conversations we were just having was around like, what's the whole, like, right? What's the unit whole?
Yeah.
So your question of asking how much of one churro is that's really, really important, right? That you've identified how much of a churro, not how much of the churros, right? You're right. It's two different questions, and it's something for caregivers to be thinking about when they're talking with their children around things that have to do with fractions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because if you think about it, how much of one we've already said is kind of, like a source of wonderment in terms of putting those fifths, if you will, back, kind of making it like a chunk, like 4/5 of one. But then thinking about how much of all of them, there's almost, they're gonna have to think across the churros, you know, so we're not thinking of one anymore. We're thinking of, okay, so if I've got my, you know, my four parts that are fits, you know, well, how does that work across all of them if all of them is the whole?
Yeah.
So you have to kind of get them thinking about what somebody said to me once, the whole story.
Mhm.
Yes.
So what's the whole? You know, is a whole one or is a whole all of them?
Right.
But I actually think even caregivers and many adults have to stop and think about it.
Oh yeah.
It's not thinking about what is the unit here, what's the whole, and then relating your question to that. I think we see that confusion in adults all the time. And then we expect kids to be able to, oh, you should get it. But we see it's a persistent problem.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I'm gonna like just a personal story. Like when I'm working with my fourth grader who's been working on fractions recently. She's very quick to just write 4/5 on her.
Oh, Temple, you're
I'm always having to say to her, 4/5 of what? 4/5 of what? Write it out in a sentence. 4/5 of what? You know, like, and then she'll, you know, and then in some cases it causes her to self-correct, you know, in terms of her, you know, thinking through what's the unit. So, but yeah, it's a good point, Paola, about, you know, it's just stopping. What am I talking about here? You know, what's my whole? So.
Yeah. Yeah. It's exciting over time because, yeah, again, I must sound like I'm doing an advertisement for these types of problems, but they're so rich and you can think in them for a long, long time. And when you start to think about, you know, well, okay, like 4/5 of one, well, you know, how many times do I have to use that to make, you know, to get the four whole churros? It's almost, you know, it's distributive. And that's, you know, a big deal when people start to reason in that way. I just, you know, again, you know, it's fascinating where you can go in a problem like this.
Well, the other thing that is interesting, as we were talking about, is that sharing situations come up all the time.
Sure.
You know, there are so many opportunities for these conversations when you have to share things at home. And so there are lots of opportunities to have good conversations that I'm sure even caregivers have to stop and think, you know, wait, how do I do this? But that's okay. It's okay to also go, wait, let me think, because this is complicated.
And also to add on to that, Paola, like, and also children are so concerned about things being fair and equal. So there's so many opportunities to share at home, right? And then also the fact that kids care about sharing fairly just is another, it's motivating for them to think about these problems.
Yeah, the fact that they're happening in the home as well. I think it's one of the best places for kids to think about it because, you know, they come about, you know, in life. So they come about, like we talked about context earlier, like context is really important. So, you know, being in an environment where, you know, these problems come up naturally. So the context makes sense, and I agree, Temple. It makes you want to share and think about, you know, the result of that and what happens. So I think there's just such rich opportunities at home to think about these kind of problems.
Do you have another problem?
I have many problems. So let's see. I could pick that one. We could talk about sharing one and how that might become a different thing, or we could also talk about using a fraction to generate something else. So I don't have a picture for this one, but Suppose you're eating lunch and there's 8 of you, and each of you eat 1/5 of this massive submarine sandwich. We could think about, how much and how many and how much. That's an interesting question right there, the difference between the two.
Yeah.
We can talk about how much is eaten. How would you think about that?
Sorry, I was just trying to think. For me, this is a less natural situation than the other one, but
Also,
maybe I'm wrong. Because I'm just thinking if there were 8 students, would they take a sandwich and first cut it in fifths? What would make somebody cut fifth?
yeah, maybe that's how they're served. Maybe a better
Oh,
concept.
I like that too.
We're out to eat, and these are just how the restaurant serves things to us. Maybe that would be, because that's a good point, because there's the context again, right? First, it has to be believable. It has to be something that kids, will accept as something that they would do. So I think that's important.
Yeah.
So I mean, with this problem, like I actually visualize it and actually kind of push 5 of the kids' sandwiches together, pieces together to make one sandwich, and then the other 3 kids I can see pushing those 3 pieces together to make part of another sandwich, specifically 3/5. But that's how I think about, like, that's what I visualize in my mind is
Mm-hmm.
they've each got their, or if I were to draw a picture of it, I draw that sandwich and maybe put a number on it to represent each person that's eaten a part of a sandwich.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think 8/5 immediately.
Do you?
8 1/5, and then I have to separate the sandwiches, right? I had one sandwich, 5/5 and 3/5.
Oh, I see. I see. And that's why I like this type of problem, because like where the other one, we're kind of cutting things up and thinking about the result, and in terms of like a whole, that's doing a lot of nice work for us. This one is like it's kind of having us think about the result of cutting something up. So like we already have the 1/5. And what happens when I have a lot of those? Do they, some kids I've talked to, they think really hard about, at what point do I have a whole sandwich, and what point do I have, some part of a sandwich, and reforming that whole for them becomes something to think about.
Yeah, definitely. Again, for me, thinking about context, I think this happened a lot when we were sharing pizza that comes pre-cut. Things that come pre-cut are great context for this, to ask this kind of question in the household situation, right? It's already cut in 8 pieces, let's say. A pizza already comes with 8 pieces. So if we had 12 people and each one is going to eat 1/8 of that pizza, what's happening?
Yeah. Go ahead, Temple.
It's really a rise, right? Who doesn't, right? We order pizza from whatever our favorite pizza shop. That's a great context for asking some of these questions.
Yeah.
No, but all these informal opportunities we have, right, that are not necessarily a problem they're working on for their schoolwork right now, but just things that are informal, that occur because of life, and oftentimes, and food is a nice context.
Informal yet rich. Yeah. I like thinking about things that are already cut up for a problem like this. Do you think parents would ever want like to give kids things that aren't already like cut up? Like if we go back to the other problem with the churros, like would it be a problem to put that in context of pizza? Or would that be okay?
No, for me, they're all okay. Even this one with the sandwich, I think it's okay. It's just felt for me, because I was trying to think, okay, what are situations when this naturally occurs that that this question would come up? I was trying to think, which sandwich comes cut in fifth? You know, I can see sandwiches cut in quarters, but I don't often see them cut in fifth. But
Yeah.
I think they're all good. And actually, for caregivers who start doing this, it might actually become fun to start imagining and creating problems. You know, things that are pre-cut, things that are not cut at first, or you know, and another way also is to share when you start, where people get a whole one. You know, you get a full one first, but then you're left with something you've got to share. There are all kinds of situations to explore then, for caregivers. And I'll let you two say something about recommendations for caregivers that you think are important regarding these ideas about fractions.
I think again, just I love the way it was put to me years ago by a colleague, which is, you know, tell the whole story. You know, what's the whole, and you know, why does that matter? You know, are we talking about how much of one, or are we talking about how much of all of them, and how does that make things different? And why is that important? I just, you know, tell the whole story and sharing problems.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jessica. I think that's a really important, and that the whole changes, right? That it's not always just the whole pizza, right? That it's sometimes a set of the churros or whatever it may be, right? And then to add on to what you said, us here today, that you were very strategic, and that's a nice message for caregivers, is to have kids work with things that need to be cut versus things are already cut up, because they give different opportunities for learning. And so your two examples here are really nice. Like, we as math educators talk about that as partitioning and iterating, right? But if our message to caregivers can just be like things that are already cut up versus those that are not, it's just really important. And looking for those informal opportunities to engage in these types of questions, just in what's happening in your family, in the kitchen, right? Or over a meal.